Hello, this is DC Hammer, and this is the DC Hammer Show. So, the negotiations in Vietnam have ended. Kim and Trump are on their way home to the homelands. President Trump flying by jet, one of the last times, I guess, before the new Green Deal goes into effect, and he'll have to take the train underwater, just like Kim is taking the train back to North Korea. Maybe Kim got the message on the new Green Deal and is impressed with Ocasio-Cortez's belief that that's the only way to travel. We'll see. But back to the summit itself, it ended without a deal, and if anybody's been involved in contract negotiations, as I was for 15 years, you know that this is no big deal. This is par for the course, and an indication of who knows who's the real puppet master behind Kim, and whether Kim could actually negotiate on his own or he was just merely presenting a set of directives that he was given by higher ups. And at the same time, maybe they were expecting, whether it's his puppet masters or if Kim is really an independent player, expecting the United States to do what it's always done in the past, or at least for the past several decades, and that is to concede to demands from the enemy, from the people that mean to harm us, from the people that have their hand out to have us give them nuclear secrets. And in exchange for that, supposedly there would be something that they would give in return. You have to go back to the 90s during the Clinton administration and remember what President Clinton did, sending $3 billion to Korea, and all he got in return was a promise from Kim's dad, the previous dictator of North Korea, that they wouldn't do anything to build nuclear missiles with that money. It was just going to be used for humanitarian relief. Kim's father promised that there would be no nuclear proliferation as a result of that $3 billion that President Clinton gave him, without anything other than a promise that it wouldn't be used for nefarious purposes. And lo and behold, 20 years later, we're in the midst of this crisis because North Korea surprisingly has this nuclear threat holding over the world's head. So, back to the way that negotiations work. If you know the art of the deal, if you've ever sat across the table from somebody who wants more than what you're willing to give, what you do at certain times is you walk away. Now, if the parties had walked away with the throwing of chairs, with the tipping over of a table, as both parties run to press whether they've got the little button or the big button, that now would be a true issue. But with both parties leaving on an amicable basis, just to say that we can't reach a deal, because Kim was demanding sanctions relief before Trump was willing to give him anything, and that's the way it should be. But North Korea now has to learn that there's a new sheriff in town, and demanding things and getting concessions up front and then promising things and not delivering is not going to happen anymore. So they agreed to disagree. President Trump ended the conversations with a walk-away movement, and that's exactly what he needed to do. And so now both parties will go back to their respective corners, confer with their managers. In President Trump's case, that's the American public, and I think they will support him 100% after the dust storm settles down from the Marxist screaming media trying to turn this into the end of the world, and how that President Trump has actually failed in his attempt to bring North Korea along and to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. It's a long-term process. President Trump has told us that. Pompeo has told us that. Nothing's going to happen overnight, and so next step will be scheduling a third summit when both parties are ready to proceed to the next step, and then talking points will be exchanged, deal breakers will be discussed. The United States and North Korea will really get to the point where it's either last best offer or some kind of a prelude to a fourth summit that would be the signing of a deal. But at this point in time, President Trump could have signed on the bottom line today, but if he did so, it would be on the North Koreans' terms, again, with a promise that would most likely not be fulfilled, because why should our enemies give anything to us when we concede to their point and all they walk away with is a handshake and a smile? So, bravo, President Trump. The art of the deal lives on. We will both go away to come back and continue another day. And on we go. And don't forget, back in the 80s, when President Reagan met with Gorbachev in Reykjavik, Iceland, and they were talking about the reduction in missiles, And it got to the point where the Russians weren't going to give enough, and America was going to be left in the lurch if President Reagan, were to sign the deal. He got up and walked away. The Marxist screaming media lost their minds. It was World War III. He was a bumbling fool. President Reagan unable to execute the deal. And if you remember history, which most people that have been to our government schools will not have done, you will know that what ended up happening after that is, within a period of time, Russia did start reducing their missiles. There was an agreement that was reached. Of course, the United States abided by their end. Russia has not been abiding by their end, and that's why Trump canceled that carryover to that deal. But within a period of time from when President Reagan walked away from the summit table with Gorbachev, the wall came down, the Soviet Union ended, the missile crisis became part of history, and that is peace through strength. And we are back into the peace through strength mode once again. This article comes to us from the Epoch Times, and here we go again with a reminder about how failed diplomacy can lead to the brink of annihilation for the human species, and that would be that so-called Iran deal, the Iran undeal back in 2015, that John Kerry as Secretary of State and Barack Hussein Obama, then President of the United States, executed behind the backs of the American people and reached something that should have been negotiated as a treaty, ended up being a sideshow with no deal signed by either party, but with a cargo plane full of American dollars to the tune of $115 billion headed over to Iran, to be then parceled out to friends of the family and friends of the regime and European leaders and such, and maybe even coming back as kickbacks to the United States. But anyway, that deal went through, and what we are dealing with now is President Trump having to deal with the fact that he put into place sanctions against Iran. And again, when these sanctions were put into place shortly after President Trump took office, and he nullified the Iranian deal, and put those sanctions into place, the Marxist screaming media told us this was the end of time. The Iranians are going to go crazy. It's not going to work. And here we are now, several months later, and yes, those sanctions are working. And contrary to the popular belief back then that since it takes so many years for the United States, the European Union, and the UN Security Council, in order just to get Iran to suspend, quote-unquote suspend, what a laugh, development of its nuclear program, nothing could be further from the truth. How in the world would Trump be able to pull this off and force the mullahs in Tehran to not only dismantle their nuclear program, but to curb development of ballistic missiles and end its support for extremists? And bottom line is, what you put into place is maximum pressure. And so far, it's been extremely effective. And that's why you don't hear the word Iran in the Marxist screaming media anymore. Because all you have to know about where we're succeeding is what words you don't hear in the press. So if you don't hear the word Syria anymore, that's because what President Trump is to pull us out of Syria is working. If you don't hear the word Iran anymore, that means what he's doing against Iran is working. And probably within a few days you won't hear anything more about North Korea. And that will be because what President Trump is doing with North Korea will be working. So even though the Obama administration had taken steps to enforce some sanctions, they weren't strong enough, and Iran was getting around them, and the European leaders, after they received their little, commission from that cargo plane full of American dollar bills, were dodging and diving around the restrictions from them doing business with Iran. And so when President Trump put into force those stronger sanctions and started turning up the heat on the EU in order for them to stop dodging around the agreements that have been reached, then it really did start to kick in. The sanctions did start to work. And since the action that Trump has taken, his administration has taken on the transfer of cash through the SWIFT system, that's the international way that funds move from one place to another, and what we've done in order to clamp down on a lot of what was going on through that. And there's a variety of other conditions that need to be met in order for those sanctions to be lifted with Iran. But bottom line is, at this point in time, those sanctions are working. They will continue to work because, once again, this is another proof positive of peace through strength. What's interesting is there was even an expectation that the Red Dragon was going to fill this vacuum, this power vacuum, and run in to take place of what was going on with Iranian oil and all that, but that doesn't seem to have happened. The China National Petroleum Corporation has suspended its investment in the South Pars natural gas project in Iran. And isn't it interesting that China, according to a Chinese state oil executive, China sees the relationship with the United States as paramount over everything else. As a state-owned entity, the CNPC will stay clear of bringing any unwanted trouble into this relationship as the United States-China trade talks are underway. So bottom line is the oil exports from Iran have been dramatically reduced. The sanctions are working. The European Union is being held to task to abide by their end of the restrictions against Iran. China is not willing to do something in Iran that will jeopardize its improved relations with the United States and end up with tariffs being placed on China as a result. And so in the meantime, maximum pressure is working, will continue to work. Once again, peace through strength. And this piece from One America News Network highlights the success, as I said a minute ago, that the United States has had now in Syria since we got the Obama administration out and replaced it with the Trump administration. And now we actually have adults and people that know what's going on in the world and approach it in a professional way, in a way that enables us to take action, to take the handcuffs off of our military fighting forces, enable the generals to dictate what should happen as far as fighting an enemy, and not drive it from the deep state to the puppet in the White House to the field, which means rules of engagement that prevented our fighters from being effective and costing American lives, unclear goals and unclear methods being used in order to achieve them. And one would even believe during that entire period that maybe ISIS was actually created by people like Barack Hussein Obama and Hillary Clinton as they moved arms from Mexico to Libya, to Turkey, to Syria, and then to the Islamic State. Is that just conspiracy theory, or are we now learning that that's conspiracy fact? But what's happening now, that last enclave in the former caliphate of the Islamic State is being completely cleaned out to the point now that even the supporters of the ISIS fighters and the victims that they created are now departing. 15 trucks have departed that area, Baghouz, yesterday, and hundreds of families are being escorted out. And this means the fighting in Syria is winding down. The people that are involved are settling back where they came from. But do not believe that this means that their belief system or intent for the future has changed in any way. For example, we've got a quote from one of the Syrian women that was evacuated from Baghouz, quote, "I do not regret joining the Islamic State. If my husband hadn't insisted for the kids, I wouldn't have come out. He insisted so he can get treatment. It's the same death if I die here or in Baghouz." So this is the mentality that comes from one of the females. That's not from a Islamic fighting man. That is from one of the females. The Islamic State is a death cult. And whether they die on the battlefield, die here or there, the main thing is they're prepared to die. So 40,000 people have been evacuated out of that area in the last 3 months, and that's the final piece of land that ISIS held in Syria. And now with the 2,300 of the 2,500 American forces over there coming home, a small less than 10% contingency force left behind, 200 of our military people, in order to ensure that the peace does take place and to satisfy people like Lindsey Graham and John Bolton and the other neocon hawks that would prefer for us to continue fighting the war. This is kind of throwing them a bone and at the same time ensuring that there is some American presence there, just for a short time, I would believe, until the rest of the forces from the other countries return to their homelands, including Russia, and then the conflict in Syria becomes a historical event, not a current event. And just to emphasize the point that around the globe, the threat from Islamic extremism continues to spread. regardless of the good intentions of other nations, to enable the movement of fighting age males from the Middle East and North Africa to places like Sweden, which 2 years ago, when President Trump correctly pointed to Sweden as one of the hotbeds of Islamic activity and one of the problem spots in the world for terrorism, everyone in the Marxist screaming media lost their minds and said that President Trump had no idea what he was talking about. Well, now, less than 2 years later, you've got UPS suspending deliveries in Sweden from their no-go zones because as the drivers go in to deliver their packages to Mohammed takes that opportunity to beat up the drivers and steal the rest of their packages. So now UPS has suspended operations in those no-go zones. And just as a reminder, in 2015, Steve Emerson, who was on Fox News, he was banned because he used the term no-go zone, and the mayor of Paris threatened to sue Fox News because of what Emerson had said about the no-go zones. It's obvious now that the no-go zone was absolutely being put into place wherever Muslims congregate and form a group large enough to influence their neighbors. And now, as this article points out, back then former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Cameron, called Emerson clearly a complete idiot for using that term. Well, now, who's the idiot? So Malmo, Sweden is the area where a lot of this Islamic activity has coalesced within the last few years. And this was the area that President Trump was talking about 2 years ago when he was pointing to Sweden as a problem area in the country for this kind of Islamic State incursion. And the murder rate in that area, the number of other crimes in that area have made it a place where even the police won't go now. And not only won't the police go there, but not even UPS will go there. So Mohammed will have to go back to receiving information by carrier pigeon. And I don't know if you've heard the rumors that Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, may actually be the illegitimate son of Fidel Castro, as his mother may have had an extramarital affair with the former dictator. The relationship may have resulted in the birth of Justin Trudeau. Who knows? But it's interesting now how someone who was flapping his wings within the last few years, poking President Trump in the eye when President Trump had invoked the ban on Muslims coming from certain troubled areas in the world, to the point where Trudeau celebrated a returning terrorist fighter, a jihadist who had been released from Gitmo, and apologized to that terrorist for the treatment that he had received. I guess he didn't have enough prayer rugs or Qurans while he was at Gitmo, and gave him $10 million to boot. Well, now, Justin Trudeau, karma has a way of coming around. What goes around comes around. The Trudeau administration appears to be melting down, and is surrounded in a variety of issues, scandals. There's prostitution issues, there's scandal involving bribes, and now threats, and apparently the threats are coming from Mr. Trudeau specifically, as members of his cabinet have been resigning in the face of all of this corruption and chaos, and as they have been apparently leaving the government in order to keep them silent, it appears there's a possibility that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and other officials of his government have been threatening these people in order to stay silent and drop any cases that they may be bringing against their former government employers. And as people such as Jody Wilson-Raybould, who was the Canadian Attorney General, is not exactly a happy camper, and there's accusations that have been made public that there have been some interesting payments made for prostitutes, for visitors from the Middle East, such as Saadi Gaddafi, the son of former Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi, during a visit to Canada, that may have taken place, paying for his prostitutes. It's interesting now that when the ship starts to list, the people that leave the ship sometimes aren't just the rats, but also the people that you thought were your closest confidants. As Gerard Butts has now resigned, he was the principal secretary in the PMO, and whether that means that he's trying to avoid some of the blowback coming his way, or he's had enough of what he sees around him, or a combination of the two. We will see. So now there are calls from the conservative side for Trudeau to resign from office. And as this continues to unfold, I believe this is only the tip of the iceberg. You never know with things like this. But keep an eye on this one, as unrest on the northern side of our border, it may not equal the unrest on the southern side, but it sure is just as interesting. And this comes from the New American. You may have seen a video online about a woman in a bar coming up behind a gentleman who was sitting quietly drinking a adult beverage, and she harassed him, was banging on the back of his head. And why would she do something like that? He was wearing a red hat. She asked him what was on it and asked him to turn around, and when he did, and she realized that it was a MAGA hat, she started physically and verbally abusing him, to the point where the police were called. And when the police showed up, and she continued you gotta love it. She continued her abuse not only towards that patron wearing the MAGA hat, but then spilled over her anger against the police that had shown up to deal with her civil unrest. It turns out that she is an illegal alien who is here from Brazil, and since she is completely and totally unhinged, continued to, even on the way out when the police were escorting her towards the Hooskow, she took that opportunity to bang on this poor guy with the MAGA hat one more time. And so she's been arrested, charged with assault and battery. And I believe that not only will she have to face charges for what she did in court, I believe that it will result in her deportation back to Brazil. And these are the kind of people that the Democrats, the Democrats, want us to allow into the country without any kind of vetting. These are the kind of people that they want, because even if they behave like this, as long as they vote for other Democrats, that's all they care about. Maybe the tide is being turned. And finally, this comes to us from the Daily Mail, and I'm sure that not hearing the words Anthony Weiner in recent days has not exactly taken the wind out of your sails. But now he's back in the news. And if you remember now, Anthony Weiner was married to Huma Abedin. Huma Abedin was the personal assistant to Hillary Clinton. As Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, it appears that Huma Abedin was running the clearinghouse for pay for play, with calls coming into her about who wanted what regarding favors and payments. In other words, favors go out, payments come in to the Clinton Foundation. Anthony Weiner was then found to be sexting with females underage, and led to the point where he was arrested, tried, convicted in court, sentenced to prison, and now he has been released. And as soon as he is released, he is embarking on a new business venture. So I guess when you go back to the 60s and it was sex, drugs, and rock and roll, well, he's now moved on from sex to drugs. And what he wants to do is he's trying to get a business partner who will fork up the cash so he can then run a marijuana distribution business, since now in certain places of the country you can possess and distribute marijuana in certain conditions and certain amounts. It appears that Mr. Weiner wants to get in on the action. So he was caught the other day meeting with a potential investor and trying to convince that potential investor that that sexual stuff, quote unquote, shouldn't really matter, and that he, Weiner, could be behind the scenes and dealing in the background and dealing. And since Colorado and California are areas where you can do things when it comes to the production and distribution of certain quantities of what was called weed back in the old days, even though Weiner doesn't know anything about growing it or distributing it, he sure wants to get into the action. Because again, once on his bucket list, apparently he's ticked off the sex thing. Now he's going to do the drug thing. And when he gets through with this, maybe he'll start his own rock and roll band. Thanks for watching, and God bless. And now the DC Hammer Show is available as an audio podcast. Just go to Podcast Garden or iTunes and search for DC Hammer or News Narrative Analysis Associates, NNAA.